please enter in the chat if you like the country that you are coming from, just so that we acknowledge the various nations and the traditional cultures of the country, and acknowledge that there's over 65,000 years. It's the oldest continuing culture in the world. And if you just excuse me for one moment, we get rid of that. We can also do another important element that is a part of all of the things that we do within the Alive National Centre, which is recognise the lived experience in the room. And I always say that when we are having these conversations that are about lived experience and that are about our MAD knowledges and about lived experience-led research, that I actually don't need to remind people that we speak respectfully and honourably about our varying experiences, but we do say it anyway. And we also say to people, I invite you to sit with a little bit of discomfort with this, because often where we go in these kinds of conversations are very different framings of our experiences. And we just encourage people to sit back and reflect if that's not your framing. Just have a bit of a think about it and respectfully engage with it. I believe that people online have been told that we will be doing a question and answer session after Diana and I have a conversation. But we ask you to enter your questions into the chat just to make it easier for us to manage. Diana and I will try to remember to look at the camera rather than the screen, which is off, as you would have guessed by where I am looking, and look at each other during this. But and we do have a small number of people who are in the room with us today as well, and that we just try to manage the questions in between. But I think if there's nothing else that we need to say, Diana, is there anything that you want to add to the intros before we get started?
Nothing I want to add, except I'm very glad it was possible to reschedule this event. Thank you, Michelle.
I'm very happy that we're able to do it too, and a big thanks to the Alive National team who helped me with the back end of setting up a new event right and getting all the registrations in quickly. I think the number of people that like that joined us tells us how keen people were for it. So I'll hold up. This today is what we are talking about. MAD knowledges and user-led research. As you can see by my little pink tags, I had fun reading the book. But Diana, I think to start us off, you invited me to sort of say, tell me about how you came to write the book.
Well, it wasn't my idea. I mean, I didn't think I'm going to write this book. Here's a proposal. I'm going to hawk it around all the publishers. It wasn't like that. In my neck of the woods in the UK, you write paper. You don't write books. Books don't count as an academic credential. I was approached to write it by an academic publisher that was important, and a well-known publisher, Palgrave.
Mm-hmm.
So she introduced me involved. We had a conversation, and I was quite ambivalent actually. I wasn't sure if I wanted to write an academic book. Because I have it's a general ambivalence that it bears on the book. Sort of torn between being an academic and being an activist. And I thought, if I write an academic book, then that's pulling away from my activist self. And I was quite disenchanted with the academy at that point in time anyway. So it wasn't an unequivocal good big oh yeah, please. And actually my editor let me get rid of the lot. And then there's quite a lot of little stories, autobiographical bits in the book if I think they're going to illustrate a point. I wrote quite a bit about activism and was allowed to republish bits of activist material and that kind of thing. So I still have that feeling of being torn. But I think thanks partly to the editor, it could be worse.
Look, as I said to you, when we were discussing having this conversation, I went through and read it cover to cover because I found it so interesting. One of the things that I actually discovered when I got to the end of it, which I thought was quite funny, is that it actually says in the back here, printed in Australia. I had to send to America for this book. This is one of the things that I thought, you know, and I know when it was released that, and still, it's a bit hard to get. And do you find that frustrating that, you know, people like me and people like the people in this room and online are so interested in this, and it's not the easiest thing to get your hands on?
No, they did a discounted, like for a month, really discounted. I can't remember what it was, like about $15 or something, and it was snapped up.
Yeah.
And that was the other thing about writing an academic book, was that the people that I knew, who were activists, but it's the same, because we're not supposed to be thinkers. Interested in ideas, but primarily activists. We're going to put off that they wouldn't buy it because it was academic, and then they wouldn't buy it because of the price. And the English ones, I said that, I apologise for the price. And I don't know if that was one of the things that pushed them into doing the discounted month or what it was, but I think it's absurd.
Yeah, well,
they paid me €750 and no royalties. So it's not like I'm making money out of this, but
it's even worse. Yeah, I mean, when I love hardcover anyway, so I was very happy to buy a hardcover version, but at that stage you could only get the hardcover. But I think I would encourage anybody who doesn't have a copy to get a copy of it, because it's great. But you can actually now get it in soft cover, which is great. But yeah, I did think it was funny that I had to bring it from America when it was printed here. But in it, one of the chapters that you know that I was going to find very interesting is your unofficial history of PPI in the UK. So talk us through your unofficial history, and you and I can have a chat about it.
Yeah. Well, before I do, shortly after, well, just before the book was published, some people who'd been involved in this organisation Involves, which was the Department of Health's Public and Patient Involvement Programme. Supposedly, patients, not really, members of the public, whatever, some of them got together and said that we're going to have 2 webinars, and we're going to capture like an oral history, your memories of being involved and its predecessors. And I mean, the actual factual bits match reasonably well, though I did discover how it came about in the first place. But people didn't talk much about patient public involvement, but they talked about how they felt about the organisation and how welcoming it was, making friends. I feel like a traitor. I mean, that was true. It was a nice organisation, and its original plans, I think, were promising. But well, I can identify the point which they started to go on. But the idea of patient and public involvement in research was that patients, there is a point to me messing about if these words, because they did. Should become research, not just the subject of research, but doing research with other researchers, or even, and this was a line, user-led research, user-controlled research. Although oddly, they said that user-controlled research should take place in charities. I thought, no, it's clever. Because academia is the top of the hierarchy. Charities are below it, so it's not really academic stuff. But we'll allow you to control research in that space. Quite interesting. I think some good projects were done right at the start, where patients and the public had a meaningful role in research. But there came a point, I can't do that, I've forgotten the timeline, but a particular individual became the chair of the advisory group involved. By the way, I should have said I was on it.
That's all right. Inside knowledge is good.
I'm official history. And then he was given a second part to his job. And that was lead for public engagement. And we thought, what on earth does this mean? What involvement, engagement, what is this going to mean?
Yep.
And then we discovered what it was going to mean because they had a day every year to promote this part of the job, and it was called "It's Okay to Ask." And what it was okay to ask about was, can I be a subject in one of your studies? So that, to me, I thought right at that point, that is conflict. Because the idea of patients and the public being researchers, it's not in contradiction, but it's going to be undercut if all this energy is going into persuading the public to be subjects.
Yep.
And indeed, get all unravels from there, because more and more energy is put into health and wealth. That's what it was about. Getting people to be subject to research companies who stay in the UK and jobs. Of course, there were conceptual issues as well. And the main one for me was about method. That there was no way in which involved members of public populations could have any control over the method. And the hierarchy of methods still stood. So if somebody had to, part of what happened with it involved was that you were obliged, if you were putting in a proposal for research, to say how you were going to involve patients.
Yep. And
if you didn't say enough, or the committee didn't like it, they could throw it back to you and not getting the money interview and prove it. So this is an amazing incentive. But to return to the point, it was still the case that if proposals for randomized controlled trial or a systematic review, it was more likely to get funded. And participatory research came nowhere. Actually, qualitative research had a hard time, even though it's much more aligned, I think, with the way our kind of work developed. Not exclusively, I'm not against those. But that, since that hierarchy stood with the funding bodies and with academia, there was nothing that the involved public could do about the method. And I think method rules in Western research. You know, it's actually the hierarchy of evidence is not a hierarchy of evidence. It's a hierarchy of methods for producing evidence. And so, because we couldn't shake that, I did once get money for an ethical. But that was very rare. It sort of lost its momentum, you know, and people felt that because that in itself made it tokenistic. Tokenism piled on tokenism. And then there was a long row about who is a patient and who is a member of the public. And somebody wrote an article which said that if a member of the public involved in research gets a master's degree, then they're no longer a member of the public, they're a researcher. So you could only be one or the other. Which meant somebody like me couldn't be.
What are we?
Yeah. Well, we're not wanted, that's for sure. we're not the authentic voice of the problem. And there was a big row about that. And I think a lot of people in my position having these two identities described it as true. Of course, I just to write a different stuff about it. And at the end of the day, the Department of Health withdrew the funding from Involve and merged it with the Centre for Dissemination, which actually means that all that's left of that promise is people writing release summaries and research papers that you can communicate with simple minded public. And in a way it's tragic, in another way it's predictable. And the other thing is, I think they set themselves up as an origin. This is the first time this has been done.
Yes.
And the students, the first time it had been done as an institution, but it's not the first time that members of the public have got involved in research. Women and childbirth, disability study, and within mental health. I was doing service user research in 1980 and involved in that until 1996. But everything before involved didn't count, not because they were this institution.
And I think, I mean, what dismayed me a bit when I read, you know, it wasn't a surprise of where it had gone. I hadn't realised that it had folded altogether. And I think one of the things about it is what you're talking about in terms of it encouraging people, but not the methods and those sort of things. We're at that point in Australia. The major funding, the National Health and Medical Research Council, particularly our Medical Research Future Fund, which is the one that's meant to be more translational, meant to be, they've got the big stick out at the moment. You know, we are at a point where there is a huge expectation that grants actually have consumer engagement, but there's not something like Involve to any great degree, and so we're sitting at this juncture of everybody's been told that they have to do it. Not many people know even how to do involvement, let alone how to bring people in and make the space. And so to see where it was doing okay, not great as you say, but it had a good set of structures and things, that it's gone. I went, you know, I mean, I think I've said to you before that changing the landscape in Australia of the methodological stuff in particular, but you know, that leadership and that, you know, user-led research, that's my plan for world domination. But you kind of look when there's where I've looked to for some of the structures and things has now gone backwards. Yeah. This frightens me a bit, but it's also a challenge.
Well, I think I half of me has come to a very radical conclusion, but there's more to it, which I might come to later, which is that we have to do it ourselves. Yeah. But you know, obviously you can't not work with other people, but there has to be a strand of work, especially in mental health. I think mental health is actually different in that, because it was all medical specialities and public health and social care. But on the whole, you know, if you have had, like I have had, cancer, you want to survive, you want the difficulty of life, that's what you want, it's what the doctors want, you're not disagreeing. And that holds for like a lot of conditions. But for centuries, but really since the 1970s, it's not the case that psychiatrists and patients agree on what the outcome should be. And that again is another sticking point. Why I think we need to some degree go it alone.
Well, I mean that brings us to very nicely the point that you had said last night was where we want to explore the big theme that really came through to me in this was your theme of epistemic injustice, and this whole idea that one of the big problems that we have with involvement when it comes to mental health as opposed to other conditions is that if they don't like what we're saying, we can just be declared mad, and our whole thing swept under the carpet. So do you want to sort of tell us a bit more about that whole, I liked the bits about, particularly in research, we usually have secondhand knowledge, because somebody, we say something and somebody translates it, and it's the same when you're, I don't know whether you've ever seen clinical notes on yourself, but I have, and I just go, I didn't say that. I just handed them and I got them and went, I wish I didn't see those. But yeah, I mean, there's so much power that goes on to silence, particularly people like us.
I mean, I think one has to be very careful with this concept of epistemic injustice. Because it's been taken up in the last few years in the psychiatric literature, largely by psychiatrists, and they focus only on what Miranda Fisher, who coined the term, calls testimonial injustice, in particular the clinical encounter. And they're arguing that we can change the clinical encounter, or good clinical practice, we'll put this right. We'll have a just diagnostic interview. But testimonial injustice is important because it's a horrible thing to happen to you. You know, to be positioned as somebody who cannot, who is not a credible knower. And I don't mean that in an academic sense. I mean, in psychiatry generally, whatever else is wrong with you, you cannot generate knowledge. And the higher up the knowledge tree you go, the less can you do it. And I think that's important. But I think her second aspect to epistemic injustice is more important, and that's hermeneutic injustice. And what Miranda Fisher understands to mean by that is that there is no narratives through which a particular set of experiences can be articulated, either about the experiences themselves or anything else on behalf of a particular minoritized group. And I think, and people will think, oh, users have got a voice now, we've got them on every committee, blah, 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 involved with LS. I don't think so. I think it's still there. Lack of insight, lack of capacity, because for all lack of reason. It still exists. But hermeneutic injustice is the other side to it, and it is this notion that there's a gap in meaning, a hermeneutic gap. That is not waiting to be filled, but that could be filled. I think you could position, I won't say mental health users in general, but a certain politicized, and the small people, mental health users, as trying to articulate a new narrative. But psychiatry, psychology, and all those sides is so dominant that you can't get a word in edgewise. You can't even start the conversation. And I think that resonates with what you said, the sweeping under the carpet, actually sweeping alternative narratives and undoing them, undermining them, and shaming them crazy. So that's how it leads to testimonial injustice, because how can a bunch of pretty individuals produce valid knowledge? Our valid body and knowledge styles, though, will articulate our experiences. That's what I think that in the wider scheme of things, is a more important concept, although testimonial injustice kind of resonates. This happened to you, and you know how horrible that is.
Yeah. I just got a quick message from somebody to ask you to speak up a little bit.
No problem.
We can hear you really well, but they can hear you intermittently.
Yeah. Sorry so much. I love talking about epistemic injustice. We did wonder if you switched seats, Michelle. I know it might
Actually,
be
Diana is closer than I am.
okay, no problems.
Okay. So all that last
There's
part,
just a bit of echo, I think.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about it. The microphone has a cord and it is at its maximum. And yeah, if we go, Diana is actually sitting closer to the microphone than I am, but we'll do our best.
yeah, just to recap, I'm talking about the concept of epistemic injustice, noting that Miranda Fricker identifies two kinds, testimonial and hermeneutic. And hermeneutic injustice is about the lack of a narrative for a particular group to articulate their experiences of themselves and beyond. And I think that's more important, that we need to develop an alternative narrative, but we keep being shut up by science.
And one of the things that is, one of these many little pink flags on this book here, that was one of the things that really struck me was that whole idea, and it comes down, it's qualitative research as well as user-led research, is that idea of, by doing this, we're lowering the standards of research. I can tell by your reaction.
So there is actually a paper that says this.
Oh my God.
It's called The Dark Side of Co-Production.
Oh yes.
I
don't think I can read it all
of them. And some of us wrote a response to it called either Out of or Into the Shadows. I can't remember which. It's the opposite of each other. But yes, this paper argues that working with service users will lower academic standards. Well, what do they mean? They mean the papers won't get many citations. They mean it'll lessen your chance of getting a grant. It'll lessen your chance of getting published in the first place. Well, if that's your standards, your academic standards, then I think they're rubbish anyway.
Oh, with you on that.
You can publish 50 papers, in the department I used to work in. 10 papers each on 5 studies, no problem. They're a template. So, yeah, it's probably true that if those are your standards, those metrics, those academic metrics count as valuable knowledge, then it's not going to do you any good. It might even do you harm. But anyway, I think it's a shame that those are the metrics. I've never been paid any attention to intellectual quality. It's not primary. The intellectual quality of what's being written. So some of it's published these days.
Question.
Well, you can nominate your peer reviewers. So you nominate your friends. They give you wonderful peer reviews and your agent is very popular.
Yes.
So it's terribly cynical.
No, I share your cynicism on that one. It's something that I fight against here as well. It's that same thing that we are trying to operate within the structures of large institutions. And I mean, Scott's just released a piece on institutionalization on how do we, as lived experience researchers, who, because of the way research is currently structured, and this is where you started with, you know, if you're in a charity, you're over there, and we had the same thing. If you're doing community-based research, you're over there, and those community-based researchers very early said to us, what can we do to have our research recognised?
Yeah.
And, you know, I put that question to you. What do you think in terms of what does research need to do instead of us trying to make people with lived experience into traditional researchers? What does research need to do in order to become different?
Just ask.
Serious. What does research need to do in order to change, make space, get recognised?
I mean, there's one view which says that if you took survivor user-led research seriously, then it would add to the jigsaw. It would enrich the picture. So it's just a question of hammering away at traditional researchers and making them realise that this is going to improve our knowledge, not undermine it. I don't think so. I don't put it that way. It's not that I haven't done that. I have. But I mean, in the long term, I really mean the long term. And I really mean that this probably isn't going to happen in my lifetime. But I think traditional research, let's say, in the science fields, is being different. There was a paper published in The Lancet last month. The lead author was somebody called Vikram Patel, who's not my favorite person, but Nick made a slide for our presentation.
Yes.
Business as usual has failed. Business as usual will continue to fail. This is a prominent, high-flying global mental health research. Equally, Thomas Insel, who ran the NIMH for 20 years, when he left, said, we spent, I think it was $25 billion. We did many cool projects, wrote hundreds of papers, and we didn't help a single individual. Equally, Robin Murray has reflected on his life's work as a biological psychiatrist, and I expressed regrets a lot of it. I have even suggested pictures like, and how until for a psychiatrist that maintenance medication may not be a good thing up front. All right, these are the big guys.
Yeah.
What's really irritating is that people in the survival movement have been saying this for a long time.
Yep.
About mainstream research. Nobody took any notice, so a lot of my ramblings. I can remember having a long discussion about the notion of side effects with neuroleptics in my youth group, and what was an effect of side effect you can imagine. It was quite sophisticated. Don't think anybody did anything with it, so talk at the meeting. Then a psychiatrist called Joanna Moncrief wrote a book, The Myth of the Chemical Cure, making exactly the points that we've been making 30 years before. So it's sad, but unfortunately, if this cracking is going to happen, it probably is necessary for the very reputable and distinguished people to start saying, well, this is not right. The replication crisis in psychology, that they can't replicate robots. Knowledge is supposed to happen in the West by accruing facts, by experiment after experiment after experiment. Well, if you can't replicate any experiments, you're in deep trouble, aren't you? So that, what I see myself and people like you and me doing is helping them along, and push is happening. So somebody I called No Jokes, you know that? Did a workshop, not a lecture, on participatory research at a very conservative conference on schizophrenia, and it was fun. So I think there are signs that things are going wrong, and mainstream science is okay.
Yeah.
And that eventually, I have no idea when it will implode. And we are gradually preparing to fill the hermeneutic gap. I think that the epistemological foundations of user knowledge they clash with mainstream knowledge. It's not a question of how can you integrate them, how can you co-produce. They actually clash. So perhaps we have to shift to like that. But that's the big picture. But as I say, it's just at the start, and I like to think of people like Robert as an ally. He'd probably shoot if we saw this. And many people in fact say, well, he just had this fake image of it. And he should go and apologize to all the people who describe questioning to this kind of attitude. But yeah, that's my answer.
I think, I mean, one of the things that you said in there is how difficult it is to get our knowledge and our views published within, you know, we struggle even. I mean, within the Alive National Centre, we've got a bit of a theme running that is lost in translation. So that's the name of the podcast that we're just about to launch. It's the name of our new zine. It's also the name of the paper that is a review paper on priority setting from lived experience perspectives that is bouncing from journal to journal. Great piece of work, but it's about lived experience. And it's about prioritising from that view. And so it's incredibly difficult for us to find a good home, even though, as you say, the psych professionals are getting things that people who don't have lived experience, but publishing this stuff in Lancet Psychiatry and Nature and all those sorts of things, and claiming to have had involvement by a couple of people who were part of our professional panels kind of thing. And it's a big frustration for us because the Alive National Centre, we work on what's called an embedded model of lived experience. So we're working centrally on lived experience is part of everything we do. I told you a little bit about our collective. But one of the battles that we are facing is how we get that knowledge into the mainstream rather than having to publish it. Health Expectations, great journal, but it's about... Well, no, that we haven't tried there, but I mean, it's a journal that's about, you know, and it means it's over there. It's not in the faces of the, you know, the traditional researchers if we have to put it in one of those specialist journals for over there, you know, it's that knowledge that's over there kind of thing. But I think that's a real frustration, but that's where, you know, people like me are carrying I don't give up very easily on that sort of thing. But, you know, one of the other things that really struck me as I was reading through the book was this whole idea of impact. And this is this thing that comes back at me from particularly people who are looking for a reason not to involve people in their research at all, about this whole idea of where's the evidence of the impact. And I put a note to myself here and said to you to read a quick section that really struck me from the book. If I can actually, please excuse me for a moment while I take the glasses off. So what I really liked here was you said evidence does not exist in a vacuum. The public are not empty vessels waiting to be filled with the facts of science. Science disseminated will be received in myriad ways, some will fade away and some will gain, but not for purely scientific reasons. So perhaps looking for impact of PPI is both an impossible question because evidence of impact is rare in the health field altogether, and one is wrongly framed in the first place if it relies on the naive idea of how science is received, a pipeline of production and a pipeline of consumption, but there are few bridges.
Pipeline, not my words, their words. I mean, was that a comment or a question?
Well, like I said, tell me a bit more about, you know, this whole idea of impact, and why do we have to prove that we have an impact when impact is this, we don't know what it is anyway.
I mean, the ironic thing is that impact hardly ever happens.
Yeah.
In the health system. Even if you can establish a correlation. So one that springs to mind was a professor where I used to work said that his anti-stigma campaign had impact because there was a 5% reduction in endorsement of statements like mentally ill people are violent. Now, the number was in the thousands. So on earth, there's a 5% reduction mean in the first place. But also, how does he know that it was the campaign that shifted it by 5%? If it's meaningful, all sorts of other things were going on around mental health in the UK. It might be something completely different. If it's significant, which I doubt, I'm insignificant, not in this system. If they have nothing to do with this campaign, I may go around and people just laugh it up. It's weird.
That whole idea, yeah, as you say, it's so difficult. I had somebody ask me recently, you know, how can we measure involvement within our life initiative, and you know, how can we measure the impact of it? And I said to her, tell me, what does effective involvement look like? Oh, and I said, and even if you can't answer that, from whose perspective is it effective? And so we do have this problem of we can't.
No, I mean, it's a double thing, isn't it? In general, it's not the case of policy politics. Quite often policy contradicts evidence. It just happens to fit with the governing political parties of the side. But yeah, but because patient and public involvement, if it had happened like it should have happened, anyway, is not epistemologically aligned with all this stuff. It's a meaningless question. You know, what we are talking about, effective patient and public involvement having an effect would be some kind of paradigm shift in knowledge, either a small location of knowledge or wider. It's not a question of, you know, if you have 2 patients on your research team, is it more likely that your intervention is going to be taken up? I mean, I do believe that's been done.
It has.
But you know, we're just not speaking the same language. But it's true that people do carry on about what is the effect, what is the impact of having a single. And I mean, I don't feel like I did just that. But I also go back to what I said at the beginning, we haven't had anything. So we wouldn't even know where to start, because we never got to do it.
So I think where I'd like to kind of start to wrap this up is one of the phrases that you used in the book was, you know, we need to turn to doing more research in the wild.
Yeah.
And then in the conclusion, you know, talking about research as activism. And I think that would be a really great place for us to kind of land now. What do you think research as activism looks like, in particular the research in the wild?
Well, research in the wild it's a notion that comes from science and technology studies. Callum, and I can't pronounce the woman's name, I'm afraid. But I think, I mean, in a way, in a small way, maybe you just talked about research questions from the perspective of the community would be part of that. But probably it would not be some kind of consultation exercise, but our methodology. Where you find out how people live and what matters to them locally. Context is the most overused and meaningless word in social sciences, but it is actually very, very important, and it is missing from psychiatry. But I think to make the concept of context meaningful, so that the individual is no longer decontextualized, and do work using methods that will give you a grasp on what matters to people and what to them would count as a positive solution. Of course, it doesn't mean you have to accept everything that people say, but as a model, equally over the research methods. You know, I think methods that I'm going to pick you up on something. But methods that capture community collective experience should be prioritized, and they do exist. And technology is making more possible. It's simple, you know. It's not a brain twister, but by the wild, I'm trying to say that life is messy. Yes, you know, life is not a laboratory. It's messy, it's full of problems. For many groups of people, it's full of adversity and challenges. And that has quite a high provoking rate in totality, not epidemiologically, for mental health challenges. All of that. I mean, research as activism, that would be one meaning of that. I think you can make it more researchy if you try to find out what kind of changes identified in that way and made it worked in that context and which didn't. And how can you replicate them in new contexts, not scaling up and all the stuff that truly make things specific to a new context. And I'm using the word context, I don't want to. Yeah, so that we have some idea of activism that really needs to change. And that would, it would include bits of research, and that would be a melding that I would feel happy with. But another thing I have is, jumping back to the beginning, torn identity. On the one hand, I see my distress and the responses I've had to it as what drives my research. On the other hand, I really should do that, because that's what changed my mind when I lost my job and had to spend 10 years living in the community. It was joining a youth movement that wasn't flip. Okay, you could predict how it would flip, because I've been politically everywhere all my life. So it's not an epiphany, but yeah. I don't know, I can't really resolve
And I think that that's a fantastic place for us to, let me stop hogging the questions and hand over first of all to the room. Is there anyone that wants to pick up on any of the threads or ask a question?
I know what it's going to be. It's one I was going to ask you.
So if you look at if you look at papers published in psychiatry these days, you'll see a gradual increase in the number of papers that have a lived experience expert amongst the authors, one or two, or else have worked with a lived experience panel. Now, some might say that that represents real progress, but I suspect from what you've said, you don't think, you think it's more legitimation than progress. Because you might see that as the beginnings of your paradigm shift that you want, because that would never have happened 20 years ago. So that's something new. But how do you assess that in terms of changing the nature of research, the epistemic violence of research, etc.?
Well, I think when it comes to radical change, no, just no. I mean, I don't think that the work has been done. I think better work was done 15 years ago than it's done now, because it's got legitimized. I also think it's got legitimate. I just give you a personal example. I found my name on a paper that I had nothing to do with the project. Oh, what is this? So I asked the senior author, I said, why am I an author on this paper? And he mumbled something. And clearly it was to legitimate the paper as having user involvement. I was really pissed off. So that's why from personal experience, but also from seeing this happen a lot in the field, in the UK anyway, I think a lot of it is tokenism. But I don't say it's all tokenism or that it's all bad. There are just a lot of barriers to progressing it. I mean, it is probably a good thing for professionals to hear what it's like to live these lives. I don't know, because perhaps they just interpret it as pathology. I mean, you have to start somewhere. Unfortunately, Asian public involvement did not fulfill its promise, which is why that book has lots of concepts in it. And I am kind of fed up with all these empirical studies, producing tiny results, or very limited results, or isolated results. Let's get, because actually empirical researchers are not pretty good at concepts or theory. So I actually, when I was writing it, went back to work that I had done in the 70s and 80s around feminism and anti-racist studies and those kinds of ideas. Like perfectly. I even have the books. Hardcover. So.
Yeah, I think that there is a problem that, I mean, I've had my name added to things in the same kind of way, and I just go, I don't exist to legitimize what you are doing, and actually I object to putting my name on something that is a risk to me. I had a PhD student recently who wanted to, as part of her PhD, do a review of declared lived experience, particularly in papers about peer work, so that she could understand, well, is peer work being written about by people with lived experience? And she said, I can't identify it. And I said, well, that's part of the structure of our publishing system. There is nowhere in a paper unless you write it into the paper, or there happens to be those little tiny bios, which aren't with very many papers, for people to actually identify in that way. So no, you're not going to be able to systematically identify it unless somebody actually goes out of their way to write it into the paper. But I do think that there is a big risk of, you know, particularly people who are quite well known, to be stuck on something to tick.
Yes, it's very, I mean, it's sad, but it also feels like really insulting.
Yeah.
Especially if the project is bad, because you then associate it with something that's rubbish.
Yeah. Catherine, I'll come back to you in a moment. I'll just we'll tag team between the online and in the room. So I'll see if Vicky wants to give us an online question, and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. I think people have had a little bit of trouble to hear and follow along. There was some engagement around the epistemic justice conversations and all of the challenges around publishing and those questions around legitimacy. I'm just checking in the chat for some specific questions, but Amelia is just raising that it's an excellent point, Michelle, that you're asked for academic qualifications for papers, but not for other forms of expertise like lived experience. So I think there's just a lot of agreement here on all points that you've raised throughout the book and all of the challenges around changing epistemologies and where we're moving to. I can see, Beck Moran, you do have your hand up. We were taking comments from the chat, but do you have a question?
I do. Do we have time for it?
Yeah, if it's a question, not a comment for today.
Yeah. I sort of want to re-ask a question that Michelle asked, which is, what does research need to do to come to meet lived experience? And I want to ask that again in a wild imaginings kind of way. Like, what is our wildest best outcome? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what does research need to do to meet lived experience instead of thinking about what lived experience needs to do to meet research? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And pie in the sky, like thinking like everything is possible.
Sure. Thank you.
We need to go away. No. Look, there's an elephant in the room. I don't want to stir things, but I need to say this, which is I have a problem with the concept of lived experience. That's awful, I know, in this context, because it's taken off like bushfires. I think the problem derives from the fact that experience has an everyday meaning. We all know what experience is. But within the field of, let's call it user legislature or mad knowledge, it has an epistemology status. And the trouble is, it keeps swiveling between the two. So sometimes it sounds like people are saying, my experience is X. That is my authentic experience. You cannot doubt what I'm saying because it's my experience, and that becomes like unarguable what the person said. So for me, if we're going to use this category, then the lived experience has to be a collective notion. It has to be a notion of a narrative, a hermeneutic that is generated by the community or parts of the community, parts, because it isn't the homogeneous one. In debate, swapping stories of time, swapping stories, reflecting on stories, and coming not necessarily to a consensus, but some kind of mapping of what are the concepts that are important, what's the right way to do that. If that's what lived experience means, fine. But if it means, you know, I was held down for an hour and put to sleep for 2 hours, which I have been, and that was total violence over my body, and nobody can dissuade me that perhaps at the end of that something even worse would happen. I mean, that is a terrible example, but it's terrible for a reason, for a rhetorical reason. So yeah, just to make that point about, because everybody's talking about lived experience.
I was waiting for you to bring it up.
All right. I go back to what I said. I mean, I think mainstream research is actually beginning in some, in psych science, beginning to come apart at the seams. I hope soon people will start to reflect on what this really means, and they will start to pick up some of our ideas, like research in the wild, like really seriously deep contextualizing the individual. So research funding should shift so that people are looking at what is called the social determinants of the system, or looking at forms of adversity that in particular context drive people to do things that are illegal. And they may be entirely intelligible to the person, usually are, but they're not intelligible to those around them. I think that there has to be, it's kind of turning the planet on its axis and looking at the outside instead of always internalizing and pathologizing the singular individual. Would be the single theoretical change using concepts like structural violence and adversity and the use of epidemiological perspective. I mean, this is not as if it hasn't been done. Poverty, racism, hostility, all those things, but not in the way it's done now. I mean, I can go on and give an example, but I think I should shut up. But that's basically what I mean.
Yeah, some nods around the screen with the comments on structural violence and adversity. There's a question here around power sharing and the challenges in academia and academic resistance to power sharing. And the question is that Anna would love to know Diana's thoughts or what you've heard on finding structures as one of the barriers, and how do we change this, or what we need to do to start changing that. So thinking about that power sharing and how academics and the academic world could do that better. Apologies, Anna, if I got that muddled up.
No, I'm inclined to say anything's better than what we've got, but actually banal. Well, Judy Chamberlain, some people might have heard of, was ignored in the States as the mother of the original ex-inmates movement when we started as people who've been locked up in the asylums. And all her life, she read about how we must do things on our own. Her book, famous book, published in 1978, is called On Our Own. And she meant services run and provided by service users, a lot of peer work, this kind of thing. The last thing she read before she died was about whether collaboration is possible. And she gave the conditions under which collaboration might be possible. And in a nutshell, she said everybody's got to put their power on the table, including people who seem to have none. But digging a bit deeper, there's some powers that are invisible. So I've said it before and I'll say it again, but there is power tied up in method, you know, and professors who are professors of epidemiology or whatever, have got to recognize that they are where they are because they promote certain methods. And that's a form of power, and they've got to put it on the table, and then it becomes negotiable. Because other methods, like participatory types of methods that I've spoken about, are then open for discussion. So invisible power has got to be put on the table, as well as status and the obvious privileges that I have, everybody in this room.
And one I really enjoyed, and one of my little pink flags was about in chapter 5, when you talk about the different terminology and how we move through, you know, involvement, engagement. We're in the co-space now, and you know the point that you make there is that it suggests that power has changed, except that it hasn't.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that's one thing, you know, I'm encouraging everybody to buy this book because I think you will all really enjoy it. But untangling some of that sort of stuff, I think, is something that we really need to do. And I know in Australia, when the code stuff arrived, there was a real feeling, it was jumped on particularly by policy, as in now we'll do co-design, we'll do co-production, and all they were doing was rebadging their consultations. And you know, people thought it was such a great thing that we were in the co-space, and were very quickly disillusioned because they realised that it was exactly the same thing, badged with a different name. So, you know, I thought that was a really interesting tracing in here of the terminology and the fact that power underlies all of this.
And power isn't a singular thing.
No.
Very multiple and layered, and yeah, it needs to be unpacked at the start if there's going to be any sort of collaboration at all.
Yeah.
Catherine,
Sorry, you do have another question in the chat. You've got one in the room, have you?
for a minute, please. Catherine.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, I've actually got so many questions I don't want to start. Listening to you, it's so reminiscent of what was happening with the women's movement and feminism in the early 80s. In the sense that there was this immense struggle to gain epistemological recognition for academic work that reflected feminine experience, if you like. And I wonder if, I think one of the reasons, it took a long time, but I think one of the reasons that succeeded up to the point, at least, in terms of establishing a foothold in the academic world. But I think part of the reason it was successful was because of multiple engagements with multiple disciplines.
Yeah.
And what I was wondering was whether user-led research is undertaken outside of psychiatry, so in other, drawing on the kind of resources of other disciplines.
Yes, definitely. Although psychiatry is everywhere, it's not just me in the consultation with the doc. It's in the law, it's in schools, it's in the workplace, and it's buttressed by, your science technology, but the professional bodies, the journals, and all the rest of it. So those are all things. But yes, the words, user has come to be associated with health.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that people in contexts that have nothing to do with health, or very little to do with health, couldn't do research that was drawing, that had similar principles. They would be different because the setting would be different, but the same sorts of principles could be applied outside to teachers, to education, and social, and could be applied to community organisation and community resilience and these kinds of things. No, I think there is a tendency, and I'm definitely guilty of it, to focus in on psychology. Because that's where I've been at the end of the day. But actually it's important to look outwards and draw on anthropology and sociology and the humanities.
Yeah,
Potentially
more sympathetic disciplines.
Yeah.
Potentially.
No, I completely agree with that. And I think I've spilled far too many words on psychiatry.
I'm really curious though, I mean, tying into that, there's a bit of a movement that you touch on in the book that is also a bit broader in Australia about, you know, lived experience research as a discipline. And I have a bit of a problem with that because I think one of our strengths is in being transdisciplinary. And I'd be really interested in your views on, you know, are we constraining ourselves too much if we try? I know that it comes from a let's find our tribe and let's be, you know, let's join up. But I also think that if we try to make ourselves something, that perhaps we lose the draw from sociology, draw from psychiatry, draw from lots of different things. What's your view on that?
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, people will have heard of MAD studies. Brenda LaFrancois, one of the founders of MAD studies, said MAD studies is an indisciplinary, which I think is quite fun. But it's a tricky one, actually. I mean, Sandra Harding, who kind of developed feminist epistemology, one of her less old books is called Science from Below. So it generally about how marginalized people's produce knowledge. I see what we do. I don't think other people. I see what we do as nested in that kind of field. I don't feel like an imperialist. And anyway, we're only just starting here. But I think in general, research needs to change its lens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vicky, did we have another?
Well, I mean, following on is the big question. Tyson has asked about whether MAD studies is more of a standpoint or theoretical perspective or a methodology or both. And I think that's a cue to send a copy of the book. So all these things are being dealt with in that, exactly those questions around epistemologies. But would you like to make a comment on that, Diana? And then Michelle, for you, is a question around whether you share similar views on lived experience that were just discussed in the prior question by Diana as well.
I mean, I don't think MAD studies is a discipline. It's actually a collection of work, and it doesn't, to me, unfortunately, it doesn't have anything to cohere around except being anti-self. And I think in a more simplistic way than I hope. But I know there is some very good work that has been done under that rubric, particularly by people like Gigi and Veronica, that I think very good. Who else? Brenda. I had a conversation with the person in the UK who's brought my research to the UK, who is Peter Barris. And I've started to write with him. So I don't really know what that means, but and we do disagree about it because I'm still ambivalent about it. And I said, but I don't want to be an outsider, and there doesn't seem to be anything else, you know, as a large body of work. And I think it's got strength, especially the bits of it that are not about psychiatry, even if I think it's more productive. How oppression can generate resistance, how resistance in turn can be co-opted, and those kinds of things I think are interesting. But unfortunately, I don't know if he meant it. His response to me was, well, you are an outlier. And so am I. So, but I don't think that was particularly helpful. So I think my studies has got things going from it, but some of it is really oversimplified. The person, she died recently, you're not supposed to speak ill of the dead. But the person who used to drive me up the wall, literally, was Bonnie Buster. Just completely honest. And that, and she's not even a survivor, she's not even a person of the she's a feminist feminist, was. So that side of it, I want nothing to do with it. Although another of the people that I have a lot of respect for is Lucy Costa. And she said she shared what I felt about Bonnie Buster. This was just in a conversation. And then after Bonnie Buster died, Lucy said, but we need the Bonnie Buster. I completely disagreed with her, but we need this. And really drill it down to the bare bones and put it very almost violent against the violence of psychology. I don't know. Maybe you do to show you where you're on it. But I don't get as far as she.
And I think that ties in, you know, Vicky said that there was a sort of a question put to me as to whether I agree with your view on lived experience and the use of that kind of thing. And I think I was thinking as you were talking about, you know, why you're uncomfortable with the term and why do I now use it? And it has to do with that whole thing of language constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And, you know, this centre started with a consumer research unit, and when I joined it, it was consumer. And I adopted that language for a long time, but it's not one that I relate to very well, which is why I've moved to lived experience. Patient makes me very uncomfortable. I don't like the inherent power that is, you know, built into that particular term. We've never used much in the way of the survivor language. And, you know, I was really interested, you trace that throughout the book as well. You know, you deliberately use lots of different language terms, which I loved, because it is testing out all of these different terms. I guess I've landed on lived experience at the moment, probably because of exactly what you were talking about, that it has that kind of collective as well as my experience I can own and that experiential knowledge element to it. Not saying I won't move on again if I find something different. I have always been more relating with the service user thing because of my interest in the UK framings of things, except for the fact that it then excludes all the people who don't use services from being, and you know, that's one of the things that we're trying to do with our lived experience research collective is be very inclusive. So one of the things that's on my to-do list is to write our position statement on not having a definition of lived experience. Because everybody who comes in initially wants to know how are we defining lived experience, and my answer is always we are not. Because you don't have to tick off a series of things about legitimizing, are you a real consumer in order to be in this, yeah, that one. And, you know, the point that when people bring that to me and say, but you need to understand, you know, do they belong in the space? If they identify they belong in the space, that's why I ask people to sit with discomfort.
That's what it used to be my position. If somebody identified as a service user, that's enough for me. But I don't think that anymore, because however much I've been saying things haven't been done, there's a funny way in which they have in some circles, which is that to have lived experience that becomes something like catching. So famous professors will say, come out as a consumer because they've taken a dose of antidepressants at some point, or they lived on lettuce leaves as the head of a charity for 6 weeks when they were 14. Therefore, they're a survivor. It's like taking a teeny weeny bit of madness so that you can join that tribe that you think, and I've got some cash here, of course, wasn't people there, but it is a weird thing. So I'm afraid I'm kind of, I mean, I am and I always have been interested in the sharp end. I don't just mean the sharp end of psychiatry, but the sharp end of poverty, of racism, so I would stick by that. I would say that there are some lived experiences that to me do not make personal member of the shop.
And that's the whole positioning of not defining it though, in that I'm curious to see what happens in a space.
Yeah.
I did say I was going for world domination. Yeah, I like to incite chaos. But you know, it is, I guess, one of the issues that I have when there are very strict rules and definitions about things is that I don't walk around with stamped on my forehead what my service use experiences are, and neither do I owe explaining to somebody why I belong in a space. And that's where I get uncomfortable because of the real consumer thing, and because of, you know, a long history of a foot in an academic world and a foot in a mad world. And so I think we've got a long way to go in Australia and globally in exploring these things. So I guess, you know, to answer the question that was put, you know, what do I feel about lived experience? I don't know. I'm still working that out, and I might change to another term sometime soon. At the moment, that one suits me without a definition.
I mean, I think the point about people who don't use services rather differently is very important in terms of the global south. Because there's hardly any services. Good, keep it that way. It's much bigger. But then we have the movement for global mental health, scaling up, you know, if it works in South Sudan, it's going to work in South Sudan. But there is a question that in the global south, there are very, very few psychiatric services, and in the global south, there are people who are very, very challenged. Now, the question is, do we want to export Western psychiatry to those people who don't use services, or do we want something else? And reminds me of somebody I know from Kenya who's an activist, who said if somebody is behaving out of character or very ugly or very bizarrely, he's trying to explain. He'll approach the women's organisations in the community, the elders, or try to explain why. why the person is behaving this way, like somebody stole their only £2, or the husband beat them up. There was a simple example that can be very complicated, but that is a good way to go to me. To me, that is a good way to go. I don't know if it would work in all circumstances, but it's very different. It's not treating mental illness as health. It's not an illness. No, it's a problem. I don't mean this in a study anyway, but it's a problem in life.